Happy Soldiers Day, and welcome to this edition of Defacto Review, a weekly roundup of the biggest stories shaping Mongolia. Here with us tonight is guest commentator Mogi Badrul Bantoy. And me, I'm Terrence Edwards. We're live on Facebook at V Television. We want to hear your comments, so send them on Twitter with hashtag #Jargle_Defacto. Okay, let's get this program started. Mongolia named as possible venue to host peace talks between the United States and North Korea. Investigators launch corruption investigation into decision makers who behind the Oyo Torga investment agreement. Mongolian authorities respond to 2018 DZUD as livestock death toll climbs past 700,000. Mongolia hails birth of twin baby camels as an auspicious event. Okay, let's begin our program with the USA DPRK talks. Mongolia has been named as a possible location for the talks between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Mongolia first came into the mix of possible venues for the unusual talks when former President Saki Elbadorch posted on the social media platform Twitter an invitation to the United States and North Korea. On 15 April, the current chief of staff to President Haltma Batolga handed a formal invitation to North Korean Ambassador Oh Sung-ho, saying Mongolia was a proponent of peace and stability for the region. Mongolia has maintained friendly relations with North Korea despite its anti-nuclear weapon stance and its deportation of more than 1,000 North Korean workers last year. That was in response to sanctions from the UN to North Korea. Mongolia has hosted peace talks between Japan and North Korea for the return of kidnapped Japanese citizens. Okay, so Mogi, in your head, why does Mongolia make sense as a venue for these talks?
Well, Mongolia is one of few countries that are that maintain friendly relations with both countries.
Yeah.
Mongolia, as a former communist country, we've already had friendly ties with North Korea, and
long going.
And during the Korean War, when U.S. was bombing Pyongyang, Mongolian ambassador was the only foreign ambassador who decided to stay in support of North Korea. The North Korean founder, Kim Il-sung, visited Mongolia twice. So there we had some legacy relations, friendly relations with North Korea. And we maintained that even during the Democratic Revolution.
In the 90s.
In the 90s. There was a clear decision by Mongolian policymakers to maintain any friendly relations we had into whatever, into a democracy. So Mongolia still maintains friendly relations with Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, countries who are still communist countries. And with democratic change, Mongolia came up with the third neighbor policy. So we hold military exercises every year with America, South Korea, Japan. Even Russia and China are involved also in military exercises in Mongolia. So we've had,
The third neighbor policy, this is basically a foreign policy to stabilize relations and balance Mongolia's two giant neighbors, China and Russia, with relationship with the West, Canada, United States, as well as Japan, South Korea, etc.
Of course. So any country that's not Russia or China are going to be bumped into the third neighbors category. So
specifically if they're democratic too.
Of course. So there's a clear national security document saying that we should limit economic influence of Russia and China to a third each, and keep a third neighbor influence, economic relationships with at least 1/3 as well. So these are clear documents that Mongolia had came up to. Mongolia was, it's a small country despite our big territory, to maintain friendly relationships with every country. And Mongolian leaders like to boast that Mongolia is not enemies with any country in the world.
Sure. When we look at the possibility of these talks, we look at Mongolia's relationship with North Korea. We've actually seen Kim Jong-un directly speak with any of Mongolia's leaders. Saki Elbadorch was there some years, but I believe he didn't get an audience. So what do you think of the likelihood of this actually happening?
Well, the likelihood might be small, but I think it's good to see Mongolia promoting itself as a possible venue, even if the chances are slim.
Yeah.
To see Mongolia's name in every article being written about the possible venue is a good sign. It's a good promotion for Mongolia. It promotes Mongolia as a peaceful country that's promoting peace in Northeast Asia. So it's good for our foreign policy. So, but I wouldn't rule it out. The two countries will have a difficult time choosing a venue that's suitable for both sides. So every country, a lot of countries would be eliminated from that list just because they might not have that much of a friendly relation. So you can rule out, of course, China, Russia, Japan, even South Korea. So there's a lot of countries in the possible list.
Yeah.
Switzerland or some Scandinavian countries. The DMZ, I think, might be in the top running. The demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. So
yeah, technically, North Korea and America are still at war. They never really had any peace event. So that would make sense to host it there. And we talked a little bit about the benefits, but Mongolia, this wouldn't be the first time Mongolia hosted peace talks. Tell us a little bit about what's gone on in the past between Japan, North Korea, and Mongolia.
Sure. Well, Mongolia has hosted family reunifications. This would be Japanese nationals who were abducted, the families and children and grandchildren of abducted Japanese who were reunited even for a short time with their families in Japan and Mongolia.
North Korea, of course, had an incident, a time where it was kidnapping citizens to better train their spies.
Right. So there's been more than one occasion where we held family reunifications in Mongolia, and on top of that, Mongolia initiated a dialogue process called the Ulaanbaatar Dialogue.
Okay.
Where it's Ulaanbaatar Dialogue on Northeast Asian Security. So every year we hold an event in Mongolia, and all the relevant parties get involved in it. North Korea, South Korea, Japan, China, the U.S., Russia all get involved. It might be mid-level bureaucrats who come to Mongolia, but it's still something that rarely happens in the world, where all the players in the North Korean security situation come together. And on top of that, Mongolia, UB also hosts the Northeast Asian Mayors Forum at the initiative of Mongolia. So mayors of Pyongyang and some mayors from Japanese cities, Russian, Chinese cities come to Mongolia for an annual mayors forum. So these are kind of things that Mongolia has been promoting to become a relevant player in a big global security situation.
I think what makes Mongolia especially appropriate is, even though it has been maintained friendly relations with North Korea, it has never wavered in its stance that North Korea should not escalate or strengthen its nuclear armament. This has never been something Mongolia has been on board with. And even so, with its attempts to maintain talks and stay neutral, they've never said that they're okay with North Korea developing its nuclear armament.
Of course. Mongolia, as a global citizen, is party to every peace conventions in their, including the anti-nuclear proliferation, which Mongolia is a staunch supporter of, and we've also always recommended North Korea to give up its nuclear programs in line with the global pressure as well. So Mongolia hasn't wavered away from that as well. But also Mongolia has encouraged other countries, Western countries, the countries that deem North Korea to de-arm, to de-escalate the situation, to come to the table and talk with North Korea.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we hear from even Russia, them amping up their armament.
Right.
So it is something that is definitely going to affect Mongolian region if countries decide to arm themselves even more. We're going to, of course, follow up on that and definitely if talks are held. But for now, let's move on to our next story. Anti-graft authorities are investigating the 2009 investment pact that kick-started development at the Oyo Tolga copper gold mine, which helped open Mongolia to foreign investors. Turquoise Hill Resources, the Rio Tinto-controlled unit that owns a 66% stake in the mine, said late on Tuesday it had received a request for financial information to assist in investigation into suspected abuses of power by, quote, authorized officials, unquote, when the 2009 pact was negotiated. There was no indication Oyo Tolga was a subject of the investigation, the statement said, without giving details. Analysts said the current investigation may owe more to domestic political infighting and the growing need of officials to show the public that they will no longer ignore widely perceived corruption in the government. So, Mogi, investigators haven't given so many or really any details into who or what they're investigating. So what do you make of the situation?
I agree with the analysts that it's more of a domestic power-grabbing issue more than investigating the investors.
So some factioning within the government?
Right. So this would be the infighting within the ruling MPP party is still going on. Most of the people involved in the 2009 negotiations are not in power.
They've fallen out of influence.
They've fallen out of influence within the ruling party.
Yeah. Even though they might still hold seats in parliament.
Yeah. Well, the party is obviously the supermajority, but as we've seen last year, where the infighting within the ruling party divided the members of parliament.
Yeah.
33 over 32 members of parliament. So this would be the fighting, I think, going on still.
And the result of that, of course, was we had a new prime minister, Mr. Holsu.
Yes, the certain faction, the faction that was not directly involved in the negotiation, is now in government power. So this could be efforts by that faction to gain more influence over their party.
Yeah. So this is almost intra-politics within the Mongolian People's Party.
Sure, but the danger is, of course, that this investigation might spill over into influencing OT, the mine itself.
Yeah.
That's where the danger is, and I think that's where the concern from investors are. And all the Western media that reported it said that Rio Tinto's Mongolia's troubles are gotten bigger or grown bigger.
Yeah.
So there is concern from Western.
There can be fallout from these things.
Yes, I think that's where
and
the
not
biggest
just
concern
OT,
is.
it could be other mining operations as well, because what happens with OT tends to reverberate into the rest of the industry.
Of course. So OT being the largest foreign investment in Mongolia affects every other aspect of foreign investment in Mongolia. So any perception of Mongolian government meddling in OT might be seen as unfavorable by investors. And as we've covered in last week's review, there's a couple of Mongolian companies who are trying to list in Toronto and a couple of dual listing ambitions as well that might get affected because of this situation. But at the moment, it does look like OT itself is not the target. But I'm concerned that it might be small part of a grander scale investigation that might affect the actual operations of the mine.
I think what also we have to pay attention to is this a repeat of 2012 and 13 where there was a series of events that led to an escalation of tensions. So of course we had some issues with taxes, some issues with some contract employees, etc. And of course the power plant, which we covered some weeks ago. So that's definitely something to watch. Now I also want to ask you, how might this affect the actual construction going on the underground mine?
OT has all the money it needs to finish the construction.
Not counting a power plant.
Not counting the power plant, of course. So therefore, I'm confident that the actual construction and development of the underground mine will not be affected by it.
Okay.
But it could perhaps influence OT's ability to raise more money to build a power plant.
Yeah.
So that's where I think the danger is as well. So there needs to be a little more things need to be a little more clear from the anti-corruption agency on what their actual intent is.
Yeah.
And I think the government needs to also come up and say something to the effect that it's more of a domestic issue than actual investment issue. So I think the messaging is always something that Mongolia lacks in. So yeah, so there's a lack of clear messaging from the government.
Well, as with anything with Oil Toga, we'll of course be following up on this issue. For our third program, we're going into the environment. Mongolia's harsh winter has killed more than 700,000 heads of livestock this year, the highest toll since 2011, according to the country's Statistics Bureau, with extreme weather freezing animals dead in their tracks. Mongolia is in the midst of a winter phenomenon called the DZUD, when extremely low temperatures and immense snow make it difficult for animals to survive. I've seen horses frozen while standing, said Ulaanbaatar livestock trader Ulaanbaatar Borja. He also said this year's DZUD has been very hard. In total, 66 counties, or SOMs, across 12 provinces, or IMAGs, are facing DZUD conditions, with snowfall covering half the country, according to the National Emergency Management Agency last week. Okay, so how do you assess this year's DZUD situation?
DZUDs are always a combination of a dry summer and a cold and snowy winter.
Sure.
This wouldn't be a DZUD would not be such a big problem if you had a good summer, even with the more than usual amount of snow.
Yeah.
So what happens in DZUD situation is that coming close to the spring, when the feed and hay is at its lowest, the herders are forced to take their livestock out of the fences, the winter fences, and then and force them to go outside and have them graze themselves. So of course, heavy snow affects that, but a lot more livestock die actually in spring when it's much more warmer, because during the day the snow melts, and during the night it freezes, which means the animals will not be able to dig through the snow to eat. So this usually, I think spring is not over, so we might see much more livestock deaths in the next month or two.
The weather is also much more unpredictable, of course, and you have some instances where if you went through a lot of your animal fodder in the winter, you're probably running pretty low at this point, and you might not have the cash to buy more.
Right. So the government does try to import more fodder from Russia, and then we have international aid organizations who support families affected by DZUDs. But this comes to a more of a national management issue where well, not only that, but during the summer we know that some places, some IMAX will not be able to collect enough hay for the winter.
Okay.
And droughts. Mongolia is big enough that drought doesn't affect the entire country. Some IMAX have a good summer, some IMAX don't. So this needs to be managed a little more better. I'm not an expert, but if you prepare enough hay, fodder during the summer, even with temperatures lower than usual, like we did this winter, where this minus 40, minus 50 is actually not a phenomenal. It's not a phenomenon. We've had cold winters before. But the issue here is that we did not prepare enough hay. And in communist times, this would be done through the government, where everybody, would be a national effort to collect enough hay and distribute to places where there's not enough. So now preparing the hay is left to the herders themselves, and some herders are not able to collect enough hay, and some do, but there's no one like national coordination where the hay, where there's enough of it, should be distributed to places where there's not enough.
So I want to get into the fact that even though Mongolia has always had the DZUD disaster there, it occurred regularly. It's almost annually now that we're seeing it in headlines and that we're talking about it. So what's going on there?
We've had bad summers, a little more close than we used to before, and people
Dry summers.
people attribute that to climate change. Of course, Mongolia's average temperature is the highest in the world.
It has warmed the fastest in the world since the 1970s.
Out of any country, yes. Average of 2 centigrades a year. So this obviously affects the weather, and Mongolia is a dry country, so
Sure.
desertification is the #1 issue for Mongolia. So
We also have glaciers disappearing.
Right.
That's a water source.
Yeah, drier summers is what's, I think, creating a DZUD situation. And as I've said before, it's not that the winters are cold and snowy. It's that the summers have been dry and that it is creating this DZUD situation.
Sure.
Forcing herders to have their livestock graze outside.
So last week we talked a little bit about goats contributing to the desertification of Mongolia. How can that be offset, or the damage be mitigated, maybe, according to some experts?
Right. So the number of goats needs to obviously come down, and it's obviously needs to come down that doesn't affect the livelihood of those goat herders. Putting a tax on goats is always something that's talked about, but obviously that's going to be difficult for.
It would be an unpopular decision for politicians.
Decision. I mean, we can't.
Taxes are never popular.
We even give subsidies to herders to the amount of cashmere that they sell.
Yeah.
The amount of wool that they sell. So,
and medals and honors.
Right. So if you can't even stop the subsidies, it'll be difficult to put a tax on it on top of it as well. And it would be a very unpopular decision because the proportion of members of parliament is disproportionate with the urban voters as well. So countryside citizens are disproportionately more represented in parliament. So any kind of decision to put a tax on it will be very unpopular because the countryside voters have more say in parliament.
Yeah. Well, we're going to stick with this animal theme for our last story. A pair of fuzzy little camels made headlines last week, as Mongolians took the birth of camel twins as a good omen for 2018. Mongolian media is calling the birth of white camel twins an auspicious event. The camel is one of Mongolia's 5 special animals, the others being the horse, the sheep, the goat, and cattle. That's cows and yaks. They are deeply superstitious and see the birth of the camels as a good sign. It was even a candidate for the lunar calendar, the camel, but according to folktales, it was bested by a clever mouse. The herder said the twin camel's birth was one of the rarest cases he had ever seen. He was honored with a silver camel peg by Dornod's governor. Okay, so this is kind of a funny, cute story, but exactly what's the superstition behind this?
Well, apparently it's a very rare occasion, so any kind of rare incident is always treated as something auspicious, sign of something. According to folktales, baby twin camels are a sign of good coming year, good year for the livestock. So any kind of good omen is good for a difficult lifestyle being a herder in Mongolia.
So what exactly is this idea of good luck? Are we going to see more goats and more cows?
Well, I would hope for more camels because camel numbers are actually disproportionate in the.
Sure.
We might have record number of livestock, but it's actually more goats and sheep numbers are growing. Camel numbers have been actually very low.
Yeah.
There's been national campaign to increase the number of camels because camel milk, camel meat is actually even cheaper than sheep or beef. So that I think there's a cultural thing, I guess, going on where Mongolians prefer sheep, lamb, and beef over camel camel beef, camel meat.
And what do you think about the value of camel wool versus cashmere?
It's also much more cheaper. People obviously prefer cashmere. Cashmere has that luxurious aspect to it.
So very soft, but also very delicate.
Of course, and cashmere is globally very popular and seen as a luxury item, of course.
China buys it by the droves as well as Italy.
Right. So from the 90s, the government has been trying to increase their export, and that's why they've started giving subsidies to herders who grow more goats, because cashmere was an easy thing, easy export for Mongolia.
Yeah.
More popular than, of course, camel wool.
Yeah. And on a side note, camels are just great to ride. Going around in the wintertime, it's like riding a giant sweater. So I really enjoy that. So I'm not upset. But we've also seen, even Mongolian camels exported to Australia. They have the two-hump camel that's native to here.
Sure, as an animal, as a zoo animal, I guess it's the double-humped camels are only native to Mongolia and the area in general, of course.
Yeah.
So
it's the last wild camel in the world.
Sure. Well, the camels, there's two different types of camels in Mongolia. One is the wild camel that's close to on the endangered list. And there's the domesticated camel, which the researchers have found that actually two different species of camels that
genetically dissimilar.
Dissimilar, yeah. The domesticated camels and the ones that are actually wild.
Okay, well, I think we've got enough camel information in our heads. We do hope that our informations and briefings this evening give you a leg up as you join the work week on Monday. Really quick, though, normally I'd ask you for your final thoughts, Mogi, but I'll spare you. I want to say a final farewell to our audience. It's been a pleasure doing this for 2 years. I'm coming up right up against my 2-year anniversary, but I'm stepping down. I'll stay in Mongolia, but I'm pursuing new opportunities. So for one last time, good night, Ulaanbaatar.
Good night.